In a live studio built to control the narrative, Jasmine Crockett is invited as a guest, only to realize she's the target of a calculated on-air ambush by Jeanine Pirro. Jeanine tries to corner her, branding her a race hustler in a fiery debate over a loaded question. Are racial justice advocates truth tellers or opportunists fueling division? But just minutes later, Jasmine flips the entire stage with raw, unedited, and undeniable evidence that no camera cut can bury. The audience is stunned. The control room spirals and Jeanine Pirro vanishes from the network, her silence louder than any defense. What did Jasmine expose that was so damning? It forced a judge off the air without a single word? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the glossy banner of justice and truth, Jeanine Pirro prepared her most provocative episode yet, an hour-long special titled Race Hustlers, Who Profits from Division. The title alone was a trap, a provocation disguised as journalism. Behind the scenes, her team exchanged knowing looks. This wasn't about dialogue, it was about destruction. The target? Representative Jasmine Crockett. To the audience, it would look like a debate. But to Jeanine, it was an ambush set in studio lights. The goal was simple: corner Jasmine on live television, label her as a race hustler, and let the media do the rest. They had pre-cut clips ready to frame her as incendiary, emotional, unhinged. This wasn't debate prep, it was character assassination, choreographed to the second. Jeanine didn't want truth. She wanted a takedown. Jasmine knew it. From the moment her team forwarded the invitation, she read the subtext between every word. But she didn't refuse. She didn't warn her staff. She didn't call allies. She accepted the invitation in silence. Cold, calculating, deliberate. When the car arrived at the studio's private entrance, she stepped out alone. No campaign manager, no publicist, just her. She wore no jewelry, no bright colors, only a matte black suit that absorbed the light like a shadow. In one hand, a slim manila folder sealed tight. In the other, a USB drive she kept sliding into her blazer pocket like a blade being holstered. No words, no smiles, no nerves. Just stillness. Producers watched her on the backstage monitor and whispered, "She looks tense." But they were wrong. Jasmine wasn't tense. She was sharpened. And then the lights shifted. The red on-air sign lit up like a countdown to detonation. The hum of the studio transformed, no longer just the background noise of production, but a rising tension, alive and pulsing, as if even the air understood what was about to unfold. Jeanine Pirro leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped neatly, knuckles pale with control. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her power wasn't in volume, it was in precision, in the way she twisted a knife and made it look like a handshake. Jasmine Crockett, seated across from her, was composed but not relaxed. Her posture was a quiet warning, a calm before something no one in that room was prepared for. Jeanine struck with the subtlety of a seasoned prosecutor playing to the jury. "So, Congresswoman Crockett, let's start simple. Do you call that justice?" The screen behind them lit up with a clip, muted but unmistakable. Jasmine pointing at a police chief, fire in her eyes, demanding answers about excessive force. Jeanine let the image hang like smoke before tossing the match. "You raised your voice. You called the officers liars. You accused an entire department of systemic abuse. On camera. Is that what you call justice? Or is that just another performance for your followers on Twitter?" It wasn't a real question. It was an accusation, carefully framed to appear objective, but steeped in judgment. And it was layered. Underneath the words was something colder. How dare you speak that way to power? How dare you, a black woman, confront authority without apology? Jeanine's tone had the weight of entitlement. She didn't seek an answer. She was setting the stage to discredit everything Jasmine stood for. She wanted her off balance, defensive, cornered. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or shift in her seat. She let Jeanine's words hang in the air, sharp, rehearsed, wrapped in applause, and watched them fall flat under the weight of their own arrogance. The light caught the edge of her jawline as she turned her head just slightly, calmly, until her gaze locked with Jeanine's. Her posture remained composed, almost statuesque, but there was a tension beneath it, coiled, intelligent, waiting. Then came her response. Not loud, not theatrical, but grounded, carved out of quiet defiance. I represent the truth, and it seems that truth makes certain former judges very uncomfortable. The line didn't roar, but it echoed. It didn't punch, but it landed. Hard, not just on Jeanine, but on every false premise that had built this segment. Jasmine had cut through the performance with a single sentence. The studio didn't move, not a breath, not a cough. The silence was no longer awkward. It was absolute, like the room itself had braced for impact. Jeanine blinked once, a flicker of something, uncertainty, rage, betraying her polished mask. The audience, so quick to laugh moments before, sat frozen, unsure whether they had just witnessed a rebuttal or a reckoning. The camera operator instinctively zoomed in, capturing the moment as if it were evidence, because in a way, it was. Two women stared at each other across a gulf, not just of ideology, but of lived truth and performative control. Jasmine's eyes didn't waver. She wasn't there to entertain. She wasn't there to prove her worth to a room designed to discredit her. She had walked onto that stage with full knowledge of the imbalance, and yet she sat unmoved, unshaken. Because unlike her opponent, Jasmine didn't need the audience to clap. She only needed them to see. The silence that followed Jasmine's calm defiance hung heavy, but Jeanine wasn't about to let it harden into something she couldn't control. She had felt the floor shift, just slightly beneath the weight of Jasmine's composure, and in that flicker of imbalance, she struck again, this time with spectacle. "Roll the clip," she said smoothly, almost with a smirk, her eyes never leaving Jasmine's face. There was no need to explain what clip. They all knew what was coming. This wasn't an impromptu rebuttal. It was a planned detonation. The screen behind them flared to life. Dramatic background music rolled in low, tension laced into its rhythm like a coiled spring. Then came the image, Jasmine, standing at the house podium in a tense floor debate from the previous year. Her voice rang through the chamber, commanding, passionate, but what played now wasn't the full speech. It was a patchwork, deliberately manipulated, stripped of all nuance. The edit cut in on her already mid-sentence. "This system is broken, and we are done pretending it serves us." Then a sharp jump, a flash of her hand hitting the podium. "You want peace? You want calm? Then stop brutalizing our communities." Another cut, her voice louder now. "They don't hear us unless we scream." Freeze frame. Jasmine's mouth still open mid-sentence, fist clenched. The freeze distorted her expression just enough to make her look furious, almost uncontrolled. To the casual viewer, it looked like a woman unraveling on the house floor. No explanation, no lead-up, no context. Just a series of emotional flashes that painted her as aggressive, radical, dangerous. Jeanine let the image linger for a beat too long before turning back toward the camera. Her delivery was crisp, practiced, and laced with contempt disguised as professionalism. "You see, she's not fighting for justice. She's fighting for applause." The audience laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Then came the clapping. Light at first, then steady, as if someone backstage had given permission to approve. It wasn't spontaneous. It was curated, intentional. A room trained to affirm the narrative it was fed. Jeanine leaned back, basking in the sound. That familiar rush of reinforcement only those with years behind a podium know how to drink in. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't grimace. She didn't even glance at the screen. Instead, a slow smile curled at the edge of her lips. Not wide, not mocking, just quiet, certain. The kind of smile someone wears when they've seen the trap coming long before they stepped into the room. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady, low but unwavering, with that grounded calm that makes people lean in rather than recoil. "You want to play the editing game?" she asked almost gently, almost like a warning. Her hand moved to the inside pocket of her blazer. No rush, no drama, just deliberate motion, like someone drawing not a weapon, but the truth. She pulled out a small black USB, set it on the table between them, and slid it forward with one finger. Then let's play. Roll this clip. The producer in the booth hesitated. For a second, there was confusion. Jeanine hadn't pre-approved this, hadn't rehearsed it, hadn't signed off. But the room had changed. Even the studio lights seemed colder now. Jeanine opened her mouth, but Jasmine didn't give her the moment. She lifted a single finger, not in anger, not to silence, but to indicate control, quiet, certain. This one's unedited, she added, her eyes still on Jeanine. And unlike yours, it tells the whole story. There was no noise now, no laughter, no coughs or throat clearing, just stillness. The kind of stillness that falls when everyone in the room realizes they may have been watching the wrong story all along. The atmosphere was already fractured, like glass beginning to splinter under pressure. But Jasmine wasn't done, not even close. She knew that one unedited clip wasn't enough to expose the full architecture of manipulation that had been built around her, and around millions like her, by voices pretending to speak for justice while feeding outrage to the masses for profit. The silence from the crowd, from Jeanine, from the entire studio wasn't a victory. It was a crack. Jasmine's next move was a hammer. She stood slowly, deliberately, her chair scraping softly against the polished studio floor. Her heels echoed in the space as she walked away from the interview desk, straight toward the control table near the edge of the stage. The technical crew tensed. This wasn't scheduled. This wasn't rehearsed. But something in her presence made it impossible to stop her. No shouting, no chaos, just calm, concentrated purpose. She reached the producer's station, where a laptop sat connected to the live feed system. Her movements were precise without hesitation. She picked up the USB drive she had slid earlier across the table, flipped open the port, and inserted it into the machine as if she'd rehearsed it 100 times. In truth, she had rehearsed nothing, only prepared, only endured. She turned slightly toward the assistant seated beside the board and said, clear and firm, play the second file. It's 90 seconds, no edits, full volume. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was immovable. She wasn't requesting, she was authorizing. The producer looked to the booth above, seeking permission, but the delay cost them. The file began to load, the screen behind Jeanine flickering with a raw, unpolished feed. The footage opened with a grainy timestamp, August 17, 2020. The setting, the Justice with Judge Jeanine studio, moments after the show had gone off air. Jeanine was seated behind her desk. The lights dimmed, but the camera's still rolling, unbeknownst to her. She was pulling off her mic, shaking her head in frustration. A production assistant leaned in and asked a question. Jeanine, looking drained and impatient, exhaled and said without a shred of hesitation, I don't care about the truth, as long as the ratings stay up. The moment was casual, flippant, an unguarded glimpse into something uglier than bias. It was the quiet confession of someone who had long since stopped caring about accuracy, about justice, about responsibility, and had embraced performance as power. The room went still. But it wasn't just silence. It was that particular kind of stillness that comes when an entire audience feels a sudden wave of shame for having clapped just minutes before. It was the look on faces when people realize they've been sold something dressed as conviction, only to discover it was just product. Jeanine froze in place, eyes locked on the screen, watching herself exposed by her own voice, her own truthless creed. Her posture stiffened, her hands curled slightly inward on the desk. Her face, powdered to perfection under the studio lights, was now visibly drained of its earlier confidence. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a reckoning. Up in the booth, chaos. One of the directors shouted for a hard cut. Switch to blackout, another barked. A producer's hand reached for the screen override, fingers just inches from killing the feed. A different voice called for a commercial break, loud enough to echo into the control room. The machine behind the screen was scrambling, not because what Jasmine had shown was false, but because it was undeniably true. They weren't prepared for that, but Jasmine was. She turned back toward center stage, her silhouette framed against the massive screen still replaying the clip. With calm but unshakable conviction, she stepped back into the light, raised her hand like a conductor stopping an orchestra, and said into her mic, each word delivered with surgical force. No one cuts the feed when truth goes live. It wasn't a line. It wasn't a slogan. It was an order, and it landed harder than anything said that night. The crew froze. The override button was left untouched. No one in the room moved. No one in the control booth dared breathe. Jasmine had done more than defend herself. She had pulled back the curtain on the illusion itself. And standing beneath the glare of studio lights, she didn't look like someone trying to win. She looked like someone who had already won, because she had made them all see what they had chosen not to look at. And there was no going back. The studio was already trembling beneath the surface, though no one had yet dared to name it. The last clip Jasmine had played, the behind-the-scenes confession about chasing ratings over truth, had detonated something foundational. But she knew that structural lies don't just collapse from one blow. They need to be torn down, beam by beam, until all that's left is the wreckage of unchecked power. She returned to her seat slowly, with the composure of someone who understood that silence, once armed with truth, could be just as lethal as any outrage. But she wasn't finished, not while the myth of Jeanine Pirro's moral high ground still hovered like a fog over the set. The pages had been waiting under her notes all along, unfolded only when the moment was sharp enough to cut through pretense. With quiet finality, Jasmine reached beneath the polished surface of the desk and removed a thin manila folder. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. Some truths don't require volume, only clarity. She placed it in front of her with the care of someone handling evidence, then slowly raised it, letting the DOJ letterhead catch the overhead lights. There was no need to hold it up to the camera. The words would carry farther than the image ever could. Her voice sliced through the room with the unflinching control of a closing argument. This is a copy of the federal criminal investigation into your attempt to plant a listening device in your ex-husband's car. You, a sitting judge, trying to wiretap your own spouse, violating federal privacy laws and using your position to manipulate the legal system for personal revenge. No dramatics, no yelling, just the sound of a foundation cracking in real time. Across the studio, the producers froze mid-motion. Even the camera crew, so used to remaining invisible, suddenly found themselves holding their breath behind viewfinders. The tension was no longer between two political adversaries. It was between the facade of integrity and the reality that now stood exposed. Jasmine didn't rush. She let each word settle like dust on marble, and then stepped forward, placing the file on Jeanine's desk. Not tossed, not slid, but set directly and deliberately. Her eyes never left Jeanine's. The light that had once cast Jeanine as a seasoned veteran now exposed something different. The fine cracks forming in her expression, the subtle clench of her jaw, the brief flicker of her pupils searching for an off-ramp. There was none. Jasmine's voice dropped only slightly. Calm, precise, lethal. You sat on the bench and called yourself an officer of the law. And yet, here's your legacy: illegal surveillance, abuse of authority, and weaponizing your power for petty vengeance. That line didn't just sting, it dug, because it wasn't just about the past, it was about the present, about the audacity of someone who had violated trust, claiming the right to question someone who had built her career exposing such abuse. Jasmine had been dragged into this studio to be dressed down, reduced to sound bites. But now she stood with receipts, while her accuser sat wordless. She gave the folder a single, quiet tap with her index finger, then posed the final question. Not for Jeanine, but for everyone watching. That's the ethical foundation you brought with you to this broadcast? And with that, the room froze. Not figuratively, not atmospherically, actually froze. Jeanine didn't respond. Couldn't. Her throat moved, as if trying to swallow back the avalanche behind her silence. But her lips never formed a word. Her shoulders, so often squared with performative certainty, slumped just slightly. The facade wasn't cracking anymore. It was crumbling. The camera, operating on instinct and a gut-level sense of history being made, zoomed, not on Jeanine's face, but on her hands. And there it was, the unmistakable tremble. One hand rested beside a glass of water, the other hovering just above it, fingers twitching, grasping for a kind of control that wasn't there anymore. The glass shook faintly on the surface. just enough for the audience at home to notice. Jasmine didn't press. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, the truth spoke for itself. And for once, no one tried to interrupt it. The moment had already turned. Jeanine Pirro, once untouchable behind decades of courtroom authority and cable news bravado, now sat exposed, her silence louder than any objection. But Jasmine Crockett knew something deeper needed to be confronted. Not just hypocrisy, but the systemic indulgence of it. The way power not only forgave certain failures, it rewarded them. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't break posture. She simply reached for a small black remote sitting just off to the side of the moderator's station. Her thumb hovered over a single button. When she pressed it, it wasn't a gesture of performance. It was a verdict. The screen behind them came alive with footage pulled from the network's own archives. Dated October 3rd, 2020, 9:03 p.m. EST. An episode of Justice with Judge Jeanine that had quickly become infamous for all the wrong reasons. No music, no buildup, just a hard, uncut feed of Jeanine slouched slightly in her chair, eyes glassy, blinking too often. She tried to read her lines off the teleprompter, but her cadence was off. Her words slurred together. We have what looks like a foreign manipulation of our democratic. Her voice trailed. She chuckled mid-sentence, then waved vaguely off screen. Just roll it, she muttered. But nothing rolled. The production assistant off camera tried prompting her. She restarted only to stumble again. Viewers at home had watched in real time, confused and then horrified. Was she drunk? Was she ill? The clip ended with her sitting in awkward silence, blinking slowly, unaware her mic was still live. And then came the cover-up. Fox News, in a statement the next day, blamed the entire moment on a technical difficulty with remote broadcasting. No mention of intoxication, no admission of personal fault, no apology to viewers or staff. Within a week, the incident vanished from their programming history, scrubbed, buried, ignored. Jeanine returned the next Saturday composed, unapologetic, untouched. And for millions of women, especially women of color, who had been punished, sidelined, or humiliated for far less, it was a moment that never really disappeared. As the screen behind her faded to black, Jasmine didn't move. She stood in the same place, but the silence around her had transformed. It wasn't discomfort, it was confrontation. She wasn't just speaking to Jeanine anymore. She was speaking into the bloodstream of an entire industry that had long defined professionalism as something white, cold, and controlled, as something she had been told she was not. Jasmine faced the camera head-on, voice low but unwavering. I was once told I wasn't professional enough to deserve this seat. She paused, not for drama, but for clarity. But the woman who couldn't finish a sentence on live TV because she couldn't control her own condition, she kept her slot. She got defended. She got protected. Her eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with absolute certainty. Is that a double standard or just tradition? The words fell like iron, not loud but heavy. They didn't invite applause. They demanded silence. In that moment, the set didn't feel like a studio. It felt like a courtroom. And Jasmine wasn't just the witness. She was the cross-examiner. The truth didn't need to shout. It had been seen. And no one, not even Jeanine Pirro, could edit it out. The tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown denser, settling over the studio like storm clouds before the break. Jasmine had already dismantled the myth of equal standards. But now she was ready to expose what had fueled that myth for years, exploitation masquerading as strategy. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flash the documents like a courtroom prop. Instead, she retrieved a stapled packet from the stack in front of her. Ordinary in appearance, but devastating in substance. Her fingers didn't tremble. They turned each page like a prosecutor introducing evidence she had memorized, not just printed. The studio lights reflected off the bold yellow highlights across the headers. There were no theatrics, just facts, hard, dated, traceable. These are internal emails between Jeanine Pirro and her senior producers, dated just 6 months ago. Her voice was steady, but laced with something deeper now. Not anger, Not even disappointment, but weariness. The kind that comes from recognizing a system's rot and realizing that too many had smiled through it. Jasmine paused, flipped the top sheet, and continued. She referred to one of her black guests as, and I quote, cheap ratings bait. The audience shifted in their seats. Audible discomfort crept across the room like a slow leak. Jasmine didn't flinch. She moved on. Another email describes a civil rights activist as annoying as a smoke alarm at 2 a.m. There were no edits to soften the blow, no studio commentary to contextualize the language. These weren't off-the-cuff remarks. They were written, reviewed, sent, approved. The words sat on those pages like stains that refused to fade, because they weren't accidental. They were intentional. This wasn't bias. It was a business model. Jasmine let that truth hang for a breath, then turned to the final page. Her finger tapped gently at the bottom corner, as if underlining the next line before she even spoke it. And this one says it best. As long as they're yelling into the camera, we've got viewers. That was the quiet moment when the air in the studio changed again. But this time, it wasn't Jasmine who caused it. It was the audience. The line wasn't shocking because it was vulgar. It was shocking because it was familiar, because it confirmed what so many already suspected, that pain had been turned into performance, that voices like Jasmine's had been invited on not to speak, but to stir, to serve as spectacle, not substance. Jasmine said nothing more. She let the silence settle like ash over the set. And then, from the third row, a voice rose. Not angry, not hysterical, but crystal clear, cutting through the stillness with quiet rage. How are you still allowed to sit here? No one moved to stop him. No security, no studio staff, no stage manager calling for calm. Because he wasn't disrupting anything. He was naming it. And in that moment, his words didn't just belong to him. They belonged to every viewer who had felt manipulated, every guest who had been invited to play a role rather than speak their truth. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need to. The question had already left a mark, not on her, but on the show, the format, the woman beside her. And no lighting adjustment, no producer's edit, no PR cleanup could reverse what had just been seen and heard. The words from the audience, "How are you still allowed to sit here?" had done more than rupture the room. They had pierced through the final thread of Jeanine Pirro's constructed authority. The silence afterward wasn't passive, it was accusatory. The kind of silence that demanded a response, not out of curiosity, but out of accountability. Jeanine sat frozen for a moment, her eyes blinking rapidly, as if trying to recalibrate a persona that had never been meant to stand under this kind of scrutiny. Her fingers clutched the edges of her cue cards, now useless in the wake of everything that had been laid bare. And then, with a stiff inhale, she leaned forward, grasping not for truth, but for control. Her voice broke through the static, not with force, but with the strained pitch of someone realizing too late that the old script no longer worked. This is a smear campaign, but it didn't resonate. The words meant to carry outrage and conviction, instead arrived hollow, limp and weightless in the air that now belonged entirely to Jasmine. What was once a courtroom voice, sharp and exacting, now sounded thin, almost brittle, like a warning flare fired underwater. She had said it with the desperation of someone cornered, not accused. And the more she tried to stand behind the claim, the more it crumbled beneath her. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't murmur. They watched. Still, the silence that followed wasn't the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of people who no longer needed to be convinced. They had heard her real words in the emails. They had seen her real priorities in the post-broadcast confession. And now they were watching her real reaction, not remorse, not responsibility, but deflection. Jeanine's final defense, "This is a smear campaign," had barely left her lips before the room swallowed it whole. It didn't echo. It didn't even land. The words fell flat, not because they lacked volume, but because they lacked credibility. And in that vacuum, in that fragile hush where the truth had already taken root, Jasmine moved. She didn't lunge or grandstand. She simply rose from her seat, straightened her spine, and walked, one steady step at a time, across the space that had once been drawn to separate host from guest, power from challenger. But the line didn't exist anymore. Jasmine had already erased it with fact, with evidence, with dignity too grounded to be shaken. When she stopped, she was standing just beside Jeanine's desk, her posture calm, her eyes unwavering. She looked not just at Jeanine, but through her, toward the audience, the cameras, the system watching behind the screen. And then, with clarity that pierced deeper than any accusation, she delivered the sentence that would mark the moment for everyone who heard it. This isn't a campaign. This is justice, finally seen in full light. The words rang out, not with force, but with finality, like something long buried finally unearthed and too undeniable to rebury. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't spectacle. It was liberation, spoken out loud on a stage that had never been meant for someone like her to command. The lights above flickered slightly as if reacting to the shift, and in the control room, panic took hold. Cut now. Go to break. Switch camera 3. Get her out of frame. Fingers hovered over emergency controls. A director's voice cracked over the earpieces of the camera crew, issuing clipped commands through clenched teeth. Break. Now. But the feed didn't cut. Not yet. Because even though every technical system was armed to protect the brand, none of them had accounted for this. Truth that refused to yield. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink. The camera trained itself on her, not by instruction, but by instinct. It knew where the story was. And at that moment, the studio, the desk, the lights, the crew, even the audience, no longer belonged to Jeanine Pirro. It didn't belong to producers or sponsors or commercial clocks. It belonged to Jasmine. And the light she had just turned on wasn't going out. The lights were still hot, the studio still on air. But outside its walls, the world had already begun to move. What had started as a televised ambush was unraveling. Live, raw, irreversible. And Jasmine Crockett, once positioned as the disposable foil, now stood as the voice millions hadn't realized they'd been waiting to hear. And as the final seconds of the broadcast ticked away, before the control room could wrench the feed off air, the truth had already escaped the building. One clip, one sentence, one line of clarity against decades of manipulation. That was all it took. Jasmine's final words, "This is justice," finally seen in full light, spread like fire through dry brush. And in the digital age, fire doesn't wait. Within minutes, phones were recording the screen. Within 20, clips had been ripped, captioned, subtitled, and posted. And within 2 hours, the internet didn't just react, it exploded. On Twitter, the hashtag Pirro exposed began trending by the half-hour mark, first in major cities, then nationally. Within 90 minutes, it had overtaken headlines in Washington, New York, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. The tag wasn't just political, it was personal. A stitched-together reckoning made of screenshots, transcripts, video fragments, and first-person accounts from women and guests who had once sat across from Jeanine and been treated as tools, not voices. Beside it, "Let Truth Speak" surged in tandem, an anthem more than a slogan, written in thousands of posts that range from raw fury to quiet vindication. Tweets poured in from civil rights advocates, former newsroom interns, and ordinary viewers who had once tuned into Jeanine's show and left feeling something they couldn't name, until now. One tweet from a former black staffer at the network gained over 1 million views in under an hour. She once told me, "Don't bring guests who make the audience uncomfortable." Tonight, Jasmine Crockett made history by doing exactly that. Let truth speak. The floodgates had opened. Corporate America noticed fast. By the end of the second hour, 3 major sponsors, 2 financial firms, and 1 global tech brand issued separate but similarly worded public statements. The language was crisp, calculated, but the message underneath was unmistakable. "We are evaluating our ongoing partnership with the network in light of recent developments." Behind the polished PR language, the meaning was clear. Money was moving. And for the first time in years, not in Jeanine's favor. Internal memos began to circulate through ad agencies. Too volatile. No longer aligned with brand values. The shield of influence that had protected Jeanine for so long was no longer airtight. Because advertisers don't fear outrage, they fear accountability when outrage starts to sound like truth. And then came the letter. At 10:43 p.m. Eastern Time, just under 3 hours after the broadcast ended, a public statement began circulating from a coalition of 27 former federal prosecutors. Some had served under Republican administrations, others had served under Democrats. All of them had once sworn to uphold the rule of law. Now their signatures lined the bottom of a digital document titled, "In Defense of Accountability, a Public Statement on Truth in Broadcasting." The second paragraph hit like a gavel. What the American public witnessed tonight was not chaos. It was clarity. For too long, truth has been sacrificed at the altar of manufactured outrage. Tonight, Representative Jasmine Crockett reclaimed the space where justice and truth are too often made invisible. This was not a media moment. This was a civic one. The letter was reshared by legal scholars, former judges, and sitting members of Congress within minutes. A quote from its closing line was picked up and repeated across major networks and independent outlets before sunrise. This is not the collapse of a brand. This is the beginning of a reckoning, and it belongs to all of us. Every platform responded. Instagram filled with side-by-side images. Jeanine's stunned silence contrasted against Jasmine's unwavering stance. TikTok turned the 90-second uncut clip into a movement, stitched, recaptioned, remixed, with a generation too often tuned out suddenly leaning in. YouTube's homepage is populated with reaction videos, breakdowns, and live streams where creators across the political spectrum said what had become obvious. This wasn't about politics. This was about power, and someone finally looked it in the eye. Meanwhile, Fox News executives met behind closed doors. The PR director's phone didn't stop vibrating. A senior producer had already drafted a statement. One anchor refused to go live until something is said. And across the newsroom, the chilling realization set in. The story had left the building. It was now in the hands of millions. And they weren't letting go. The moment the studio lights dimmed and the broadcast ended, the world outside kept spinning. But Jeanine Pirro did not reappear. She had entered the evening as the architect of control, a figure whose voice had been injected in living rooms for decades. She exited it not with the signature of a closing monologue, but with the sharp, clean vacuum of total absence. Not suspended, not removed. She simply disappeared. Like a ghost who had realized too late the walls were see-through. No follow-up tweet, no rebuttal segment, no written statement. For a woman who had made a career weaponizing immediacy, the delay in response spoke louder than any closing argument she had ever delivered. And in an age where disappearance always prompts speculation, Jeanine's silence became its own kind of confession. By sunrise the next morning, millions had watched the final confrontation on loop. Jasmine Crockett's line, "This is justice," finally seen in full light, was being printed on protest posters and quoted beneath headlines. The broadcast wasn't just memorable, it was historic. And Jeanine, so used to riding the wave of her own controversies, did something she had never done before. She retreated, vanished, evaporated. No apology, no denial, no fight. Her social media team, usually aggressive in framing her as fearless, quietly deleted scheduled posts for the week. No holiday greetings, no book promotions, no talking points, just silence, which for someone like her was the loudest sound in the room. When Saturday arrived, a week after the broadcast, viewers tuned in, expecting fire. What they found was a substitution, no Jeanine, no acknowledgement. A bland, mid-tier anchor sat in her place, introducing pre-approved topics with lifeless neutrality. The network offered only a vague line at the top of the hour. "Judge Pirro is off this evening. Will return to regular programming shortly." That phrase, "off this evening," was all they said. No timeline, no reason, and most importantly, no end date. By Monday, media insiders were buzzing. It wasn't just about her disappearance. It was about what wasn't being said. Jeanine wasn't on leave. She hadn't fallen ill, and sources confirmed there had been no vacation filed in the talent calendar. Her chair had gone cold, not through policy, but through panic. Executives refused to name it, but staff inside the network knew what had happened. Jasmine hadn't just humiliated Jeanine, she had made the receipts too visible to ignore. The kind of visible that corporate legal teams can't bury. The kind of visible that compliance teams are required to investigate. The kind that board members call meetings about. Internally, executives were torn between two instincts: contain the fallout or amputate the risk. Jeanine had been profitable for years. Controversial, yes, but profitable. She brought in a certain audience, spoke to a certain rage, made advertisers nervous but excited. But now that same rage, the one she had spent decades cultivating, was pointed back at her. Social media was on fire. Pirro exposed wasn't just trending, it was sticking. Her old sound bites were being repurposed by critics with timestamps. TikTok creators were playing side-by-side comparisons of her berating black female politicians with her meek response when finally questioned. It wasn't just bad optics. It was systemic unraveling, and the advertisers were watching. By the end of week one, 3 of the show's top sponsors had frozen contracts. Not because of pressure, because of exposure. Brands don't care about controversy. They care about what they can't explain to shareholders. And this time, there was no buffer. The clips weren't hearsay. They were on air. Jasmine had walked into a broadcast trap and broke it open from the inside. And Jeanine, once the face of righteous fury, had nothing left to throw but the words smear campaign, which dissolved on contact. What followed wasn't a campaign against her. It was a mirror held up too long, too close, and too clearly. Week 2 arrived, still no Jeanine. Her studio remained intact, the desk untouched, but the seat had become radioactive. Internal memos leaked to the press showed that producers had been instructed to prepare for a restructured Q3 lineup. Translated, Jeanine was no longer guaranteed her hour. Her name was quietly removed from the upcoming fall media tour. Her publisher postponed the launch of her next book. Colleagues who once praised her publicly now referred to her as a controversial figure in interviews. The ground under her was not shifting, it was disintegrating. Some of her supporters online tried to launch defenses. She's being silenced. It's cancel culture. But they couldn't argue with what had been shown. Emails with her name on them. Language no one could spin as a joke. A mic catching her say, "I don't care about truth as long as the ratings stay up." And when defenders said she was ambushed, viewers remembered what they saw. A woman given every chance to respond in choosing silence. By week 3, the silence wasn't just strategic, it was existential. Jeanine had become a liability no one wanted to name. When a public figure disappears, people ask, where is she? But when no one answers, not even her allies, something deeper happens. People stop asking, they move on. They realize the show doesn't need her to survive, that her absence isn't temporary, it's revealing. And somewhere in that same window, a shift occurred in the public's language. They stopped calling what happened a takedown. They started calling it a turning point, a reckoning. Not just for Jeanine Pirro, but for the machine she stood for. The machine that had always spun outrage into influence, always framed control as confidence, always edited dissent into disarray. That machine had miscalculated. It thought Jasmine Crockett would fold. Instead, she flipped the lens. And now, the woman who once ended every broadcast with fire in her voice had left her show in silence. Not suspended, not censored, revealed. And that's the difference. Because a suspension implies a mistake, a misstep, a temporary wound, but a revelation that lingers, that stains, that doesn't need to scream to be heard. By week 4, the seat remained empty. Still no Jeanine, still no word. And in homes across the country, people stopped asking, when is she coming back? They asked something far more telling. Should she? And deep down, they knew the answer. It didn't end when Jeanine Pirro vanished from the screen. That was just the beginning. Her absence, cold and unexplained, was supposed to be a pressure release, a way to contain the explosion without admitting there had been one. But the country had already seen too much. The truth had gone live. The footage had been clipped, shared, remixed, dissected, and studied. And what Jasmine Crockett had said, "This isn't a campaign, this is justice," finally seen in full light, was no longer just a line from a confrontation. It had become a crack in the wall, and light was pouring through. At first, it moved through expected channels, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, but it didn't stay there. The story spread not because it was sensational, but because it was clarifying. People who had never heard Jasmine's name before now saw her as the woman who stood her ground without shouting, who dismantled decades of spin using nothing but receipts, poise, and a voice that didn't shake, even when the system tried to shake her. And more than anything else, people saw something they hadn't expected to see on a major network, a lie unraveling in real time, and no one able to stop it. Colleges took notice, professors in journalism, law, political science, people who had long taught case studies from Watergate or the Pentagon Papers, now added the Crockett Pirro broadcast to their syllabi. Not as scandal, as pedagogy. One media ethics professor at Columbia called it a moment when truth outpaced production. Students analyzed body language, sequencing, framing tactics, and how Jasmine, without raising her voice, had reversed the flow of power in a studio designed to diminish her. Civil rights organizations echoed the sentiment. The NAACP issued a rare statement praising not just Jasmine's composure, but her methodology. This was not a takedown, it was a restoration of standards. Black Women's PAC shared a digital archive titled Number, Let Her Speak, a Toolkit for Public Discourse, featuring annotated clips from the broadcast and templates for responding to media manipulation. Across forums and panels, a new question emerged, not about whether Jasmine had won, but whether this was the beginning of a shift. Meanwhile, supporters of Jeanine scrambled for a counter-narrative, but it wasn't sticking. They claimed it was an ambush, a setup, an act of political theater, but none of it held. Not against the footage, not against the emails, not against the quote, "I don't care about truth as long as the ratings stay up." Caught on a hot mic. You can't reframe a confession. You can't spin a tremor in your voice after being confronted with evidence. And that was the problem for Jeanine's defenders. The tape didn't lie, but the echo was about more than one woman. As her words spread, Jasmine's image began to take on a life beyond the clip. Artists painted murals of her mid-sentence, eyes steady, hand holding the DOJ folder she had pulled from beneath her notes. A spoken word artist in Chicago performed a monologue titled "The Table Flipped Itself," using the exact court-precise tone Jasmine had used in that studio, flipping every accusation back into a mirror. The moment became art, not because of spectacle, but because of truth's shape finally being visible. And Jasmine? She stayed quiet. No press tour, no self-congratulations. In fact, she rejected every major interview request in the first week. CNN, MSNBC, even NPR. She didn't go. She didn't need to. The work spoke louder than her commentary ever could. When a journalist from The Atlantic reached out for an exclusive, she replied with one sentence, "I'm not interested in telling the story louder. I'm interested in helping others see how to build one better." Instead, she reappeared 5 days later, unannounced, on the campus of Howard University. No security detail, no team, just her. She stepped into a lecture hall full of law students and began speaking without cameras, without filters, without fanfare. A visiting student recorded just 60 seconds on her phone. A single answer Jasmine gave to a young black woman who asked how to deal with being labeled too assertive. Jasmine paused and then said, "Let them label you. They have to name the thing they fear before they try to erase it. Just make sure that when they call you loud, you are also right. When they call you unprofessional, make sure you've brought the facts. And when they call you angry, smile, because it means they're no longer comfortable with your silence." That clip, raw, quiet, off the record, surpassed 5 million views in 48 hours. Suddenly, the narrative had inverted. Jasmine wasn't a politician. She wasn't even just a lawyer. She had become a reference point for women, for people of color, for anyone who had been talked over, edited out, or told to calm down when all they were doing was telling the truth. And it wasn't that she had humiliated Jeanine Pirro. It was that she hadn't needed to. She let the documents speak. She let the emails speak. She let the camera finally turn toward the right person, do what it was supposed to do, reveal. Back at the network, producers whispered about her with a strange mix of fear and awe. One, caught on a hot mic during a rehearsal, muttered, "I've never seen someone walk into a setup and flip the whole thing upside down without raising her voice." And it was true. Jasmine hadn't fought back the way people expected. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't interrupted. She had done something far more dangerous. She had been undeniable. In New York, a group of young journalists launched a podcast series titled Unedited. What they didn't expect her to say focused entirely on media manipulation and guest framing. Their first episode, a breakdown of every camera cut and line interruption used on Jasmine in past interviews, compared to the uninterrupted 40 minutes from Justice and Truth. The difference was staggering. One student host put it bluntly: when she was edited, she was emotional. When she wasn't, she was brilliant. The truth wasn't just in the content, it was in the airtime. And in D.C., congressional aides began holding internal workshops on narrative containment, how to stop truth from being repackaged before it hits the public. Jasmine didn't teach them. She didn't even attend. But they used her anyway, used her presence, her methods, her timing, because what she had done wasn't just rare, it was repeatable. And that's what terrified her opponents most. Because once someone shows others how to take back the microphone, you can't mute that knowledge. And so the echo grew, not because she demanded it, but because truth, once seen, doesn't shrink. It multiplies, it spreads, it whispers across podiums and shouts inside classrooms. It fills the space where silence used to dominate. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't ask for applause. It just keeps moving, like Jasmine, forward, unshaken, unedited. Finally, undeniable. By the 6th week, the silence was no longer an anomaly. It was the new normal. Jeanine Pirro's name had disappeared from the network crawl, her photo quietly removed from the primetime banner that once broadcast her image nightly to millions. Her chair remained empty, not out of scheduling confusion or technical oversight, but out of necessity. She hadn't just become controversial, she had become unsustainable. In the editorial halls of the network she once commanded with certainty, she was now a cautionary tale. Not because she had lost control, but because the machine that once protected her had been shown in real time to be complicit. Inside the executive suite, a reckoning was underway, one not driven by morality, but by metrics. Viewership data didn't lie. The Jasmine Crockett confrontation had sparked the highest viewer retention the network had seen in over a year. But in a twist that confused executives and terrified advertisers, the replay value wasn't favoring their brand. Clips were not being shared with hashtags like #support Pirro or #free speech. They were going viral with captions like, "This is what accountability looks like," and "She came with facts, not fury." Even worse for the network, the most replayed moments, based on digital analysis, weren't the fiery exchanges. They were the pauses, the silences, the close-ups on Jeanine's trembling hands. The camera pans to Jasmine's unreadable expression as she delivered line after surgical line with calm, devastating precision. For the network, the threat wasn't the outrage, it was the clarity. Internally, the conversation shifted from, "When can we bring Jeanine back?" to "Can we afford to?" A roundtable meeting between programming heads, brand integrity teams, and legal advisors produced a stunning proposal. A new on-air standards policy, something the network had previously mocked other stations for attempting. The document was drafted quietly, without public announcement, and distributed to anchors, panel hosts, and producers with a bland email header: "Updated guest engagement protocols, internal only." But the contents were anything but bland. It outlined what could no longer be done under the guise of commentary. No pre-edited clips presented as spontaneous guest reactions. No framing guests with unverified background slates. No off-camera editorializing during breaks while mics remain hot. And most notably, all live confrontational segments must include full uncut release clauses for the guest. To some, it read like policy. To others, it read like an admission. We're not just changing the rules, we're admitting we broke them. Behind the scenes, the shift in tone was even more dramatic. A junior associate producer in charge of pre-interview prep for political guests reportedly refused to participate in a panel segment that mirrored the Pirro Crockett ambush structure. Her words, leaked to the press, were sharp and simple. "I'm not going to help manufacture optics that can get someone's reputation killed in the first 5 minutes. That's not journalism, that's warfare." She wasn't fired, she was promoted. The ripple effect wasn't confined to the network. Other studios took notice. A mid-sized competitor quietly paused development on a politically charged debate show after test audiences said repeatedly that they didn't want to see another Jasmine moment, but from the other side. It wasn't fear of confrontation that unsettled people. It was fear of watching someone being set up again. Jasmine hadn't just revealed a bias, she had decoded a tactic, and viewers now saw it in other shows. They saw it in tone, in clip timing, in the difference between a mic being left on or mysteriously cut. Everywhere the Jasmine moment was referenced, a new phrase began to emerge across campuses, newsrooms, and classrooms. Air it in full, a simple demand, a radical one, because the public was tired of post-production narratives. They had seen what happens when truth isn't clipped, when fire doesn't get framed as chaos, when a woman's conviction isn't reduced to an attitude problem. They had seen what justice looked like uncut, and they wanted more. And yet through all this, Jasmine remained deliberately quiet. She made no appearances at rallies. She didn't host podcasts. She didn't sell books or monetize the moment. When a prominent liberal talk show host offered her an exclusive appearance and suggested she launch a media channel of her own, her response was clear and immediate. "I'm not here to cash in on clarity. I'm here to protect it." Instead, she used the moment to do what she'd always done: legislate. Her office introduced a bipartisan bill requiring media institutions to disclose editorial alterations in political coverage when clips are condensed for commentary purposes. While the bill itself would face an uphill battle in Congress, its introduction alone sent shockwaves. It wasn't about censorship, it was about transparency. And Jasmine knew that even if it didn't pass, the debate would force conversations into places where silence had long been policy. In education circles, her presence had already become canonical. Law professors began incorporating her testimony, rhetorical methods, and posture under pressure into ethics units. In a groundbreaking panel at Stanford, a media professor declared Jasmine's confrontation the most masterclass use of courtroom discipline applied to a broadcast space in modern American history. It wasn't about passion, it was about precision. Meanwhile, students from historically black colleges and universities began organizing under a new name, the Clarity Collective, using Jasmine's moment as a framework for dismantling media bias and producing youth-led accountability journalism. Their slogan? "We don't need more airtime, we need fair time." They didn't ask for permission, they took back the mic. And through all of this, the most remarkable thing was that Jasmine never seemed to change. She didn't alter her walk, her tone, her approach. She still showed up to the House with binders full of policy. She still argued case law like a professor cross-examining time. She still wore the same steady steel beneath her voice. But now the world around her had shifted. The lights didn't glare at her anymore. They waited. The cameras didn't rush to cut. They listened. Because somewhere in those 7 minutes of live television and the weeks that followed, something had been rewritten. Not the rules, the expectation that people would now notice the moment a woman was interrupted, that they would question why one clip gets edited and another doesn't, that they would remember that justice doesn't always look like a verdict. It sometimes looks like a woman sitting still while someone else unravels. And as Jeanine Pirro's silence stretched from weeks into what now resembled an ending, Jasmine's echo didn't just remain, it evolved. From a clip to a conversation, from a confrontation to a case study, from a singular voice to a standard. She didn't just survive the moment they designed to crush her. She turned it into the one thing they never expected, a precedent. And in the weeks after the confrontation faded from the trending lists, when Jeanine's chair was no longer news, and Jasmine's moment had become material for scholars, something deeper remained. Not the memory of who shouted loudest, not the viral clip with the most views, but a quiet, undeniable shift in how people understood power, Not just who holds it, but how it's held, and who gets punished for using it right. It was no longer about the woman who had vanished. It was about the woman who had remained, and what it cost her to do so. Because if there was one thing the moment exposed more clearly than anything else, it was this. Jasmine Crockett was never meant to win in that room. She was invited to be boxed in, framed, discredited. She walked into a studio designed like a courtroom, except the judge, jury, and camera angles were already aligned against her. The lighting wasn't neutral. The producers weren't impartial. The questions weren't accidental. Every second was calibrated to trigger her into confirming their narrative, the angry black woman who doesn't know her place. And yet, she sat still. She let the trap spring, and when it did, she didn't fight it. She revealed it. That is the human lesson that still pulses beneath the surface of this entire story. It's not just about media manipulation. It's about how resilience survives when no one's clapping for it. When someone walks into a space knowing they've been invited not as an equal, but as bait, and they still show up, still speak, still sit tall. Jasmine's victory wasn't just intellectual, it was moral, spiritual. It was the strength of someone who understood that injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles across the table while handing you a microphone and dares you to stay calm. That's what she did. And for millions watching, the lesson wasn't about style, it was about survival. Because how many people, especially women of color, had sat across from a desk like that, in an office, a courtroom, a classroom, knowing the outcome was already scripted? How many had been told, don't raise your voice, don't sound too certain, don't fight back, smile through it? But Jasmine's lesson wasn't in compliance, it was in control. She didn't contort herself to make the room comfortable. She made the room adjust to the weight of her truth. And when the system demanded she either explode or shrink, she did neither. She expanded. Because justice isn't always delivered in verdicts or applause. Sometimes it's the way someone holds eye contact while being misrepresented. Sometimes it's the clarity of a sentence that slices through decades of stereotype. Sometimes it's the refusal to flinch while being called everything but right. Jasmine was right, and she knew it. That's what scared them. Not her presence, but her precision, her refusal to be anything other than herself. No louder, no quieter, no softer, no angrier than truth required. And that's where the deeper injustice lives, in how much effort she had to summon just to be treated as credible. In a just world, Jasmine's documents would have spoken for themselves. Her legal background, her preparation, her arguments should have been enough. But in this world, she had to bring receipts, restraint, and resolve, just to be heard at the same volume others were handed by default. The lesson isn't just that she endured it, it's that she shouldn't have had to. That's what stings beneath the victory. That's what makes it human. Not the fact that she won, but the fact that she had to bleed just to get into the ring. But she didn't bleed alone, because something else happened that night. Something far bigger than a viral moment. Jasmine's posture, her silence, her precision became permission. Permission for people watching, people like her, people unlike her, to no longer apologize for the space they occupy. She didn't just speak truth to power, she showed what it looked like when power tried to silence truth, and failed. Not with fists, not with fury, but with a calm that said, you will not redefine me, you will not edit me, you will not bury me under your lighting and your laugh tracks. And for the first time in a long time, people saw what that kind of dignity looked like. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was unflinching. Because Jasmine taught something many had forgotten. The truth doesn't have to yell, it just has to stand its ground. That's the real transformation. Not in the network, not in the ratings, in us. In the way we now pause when we see someone being cornered on TV. In the way we notice who gets to speak uninterrupted. In the way we recognize when a calm woman is being provoked into fury, not for the truth, but for the headline. We saw the trap. And now that we've seen it, we can't unsee it. Because Jasmine didn't just defeat a host, she exposed a blueprint. And now others are picking it up. Not to fight, but to reclaim. To walk into boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, and say, I won't soften to make you feel safe. I won't shrink to make you look tall. I am not here to audition for your tolerance. I am here to represent the truth. That's what Jasmine did. That's the human lesson. That strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just doesn't blink. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside the Capitol, as the nation holds its breath, Jasmine Crockett stands alone, calm, composed, while Jim Jordan, seconds from victory, hurls the word unqualified like a final blow. But what starts as an insult becomes a turning point, as Jasmine flips the chamber, the vote, and the narrative without raising her voice. In a room built to silence her, she rewrites the rules with nothing but facts and fire. This isn't just a political battle, it's a test of who defines power in America. But what happens when the word meant to break her ends up destroying him instead? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The House chamber was already thrumming with quiet tension when the doors opened. Reporters lined the back rows like vultures, their phones already streaming. Whispers of, "He's got the votes," rippled through the air as Jim Jordan settled into his seat in the front row. Shoulders square, chin up, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth like he could already hear the gavel in his hand. He wore victory like a tailored suit. Around him, Republican allies nodded with rehearsed confidence, and even a few wavering moderates looked ready to fold. Everything about Jordan today radiated inevitability. This was supposed to be his coronation, the moment the chaos of a deadlocked house ended, with him sitting on the throne. The cameras didn't just follow him, they orbited. But then the temperature in the room shifted. The chamber door opened again, slower this time. Jasmine Crockett stepped in. No entourage, no eye contact, just a woman alone in a storm, with one hand wrapped tightly around a single manila folder. She didn't scan the room, she measured it. Each step echoed louder than the last, even though the carpet swallowed the sound. Her heels moved not with arrogance, but with precision, like a litigator walking into a trial she knew they wanted her to lose. The weight of dozens of power brokers tried to ignore her presence, but couldn't. She took her seat, row 4, aisle seat, 2 down from the press box, then placed the file flat on the desk in front of her. Thin, quiet, unassuming. But inside was dynamite wrapped in legality, and she wasn't here to ask for justice. She was here to demand it. But inevitability has a way of growing brittle under scrutiny. And as Jasmine Crockett lowered her file and fixed her gaze on the podium, the illusion of control began to crack. Jim Jordan stood up like a man rehearsed. His suit was flawless, navy with silver pinstripes, a nod to authority, to tradition. His every movement radiated certainty, not the nervous kind, but the type born from years of being told, "You belong here." The chamber lights caught the edge of his glasses as he adjusted the mic, pausing with the poise of someone who had practiced this speech in his head 100 times. All eyes were on him. He wasn't just walking toward a vote, he was walking toward a legacy. Behind him, the speaker's chair sat like a throne carved from assumption. The room, tense and expectant, waited for a man they believed was already halfway crowned. He began without ceremony. "I'm not surprised," Jordan said, hands braced on the podium, voice controlled but deliberate, "that people like Representative Jasmine Crockett oppose my nomination." He let it hang, half insult, half dare. The air stiffened. He continued, slower now, weighing each word like a weapon. "When someone unqualified sees real standards, real leadership, they feel threatened." Gasps didn't echo, but they rippled. The insult wasn't masked, wasn't even subtle. It wasn't a disagreement on policy or process. It was personal, targeted, sharp, a knife disguised as an opinion. One word, unqualified, and the room knew exactly what he meant. Not just lacking experience, not just disagreement. Unfit, unworthy, unwelcome. And then he turned his head. His eyes locked onto Jasmine with full intent. Not a glance. A statement. Measured. Calculated. The kind of look a man gives when he thinks he's already won and just wants to twist the blade. That's when the cameras moved. As if drawn by gravity, the lenses snapped to Jasmine Crockett's face. There was no visible reaction. Not a breath out of rhythm, not a twitch in her jaw. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She didn't shift. It was a portrait of control so absolute, it became louder than any rebuttal. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was warning. She had been called worst by better men and hadn't flinched then either. But what made this moment different, what made it heavy, was that the word hadn't come from a stranger. It came from the man who wanted to lead her chamber. A man who had once tried to rewrite an election result. A man who had dodged subpoenas, refused accountability, and now stood at a podium preaching about standards. He said she was unqualified. The hypocrisy wasn't just insulting, it was clarifying. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on him, unwavering. The chamber around her, full of people who had written her off the moment she walked in, now leaned slightly forward, waiting, wondering. Would she interrupt? Would she walk out? Would she call for order? She did nothing. And in that stillness, she reclaimed the room. Because deep down, everyone watching knew. Jordan wasn't defending equalifications. He was defending territory. The unspoken rule that certain voices, certain faces, should only ever be visitors in power's house, never hosts. And today, Jasmine Crockett had dared to stand in that house like she built it. The word unqualified had been used like a brand, a way to silence, to reduce, to dismiss. But it had landed on someone who knew exactly how to hold it without letting it define her. Jim Jordan thought he had silenced her. What he had done, without realizing it, was light the fuse. He thought he had silenced her. What he didn't realize, what he'd never learned to recognize, was that some silences aren't the absence of resistance. They are the calm before a reckoning. As Jordan adjusted the mic with the confidence of someone certain he wouldn't be challenged, the hum of the chamber dropped to a hush. He raised his voice slightly, not to yell, but to make sure every syllable sliced clean through the air. "You know what I've learned in this place," he said, pacing slowly before the chamber. "The louder someone shouts about justice, the less they actually understand how to lead." His gaze floated, casual, almost bored, until it stopped on her. "That's why I'm not surprised that people like Representative Jasmine Crockett are opposing me." A murmur rolled through the back rows. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't look up. Her pen tapped once against the folder beside her hand, then slid into motion. Clean, even strokes on the page. Jordan kept going. "See, when someone who's never led anything of real consequence walks into a room like this, one built on experience, integrity, order, they get uncomfortable," he said, voice cooling like steel in water. "They lash out, they protest. And why?" He leaned into the microphone. "Because when someone unqualified sees real standards, real leadership, they feel threatened." The word rang out again, unqualified, not tossed casually, but hammered down like a gavel of contempt. Some looked toward Jasmine, expecting her to recoil, to react, but she didn't. Her eyes stayed on the paper. Her pen didn't pause. If her breath caught, no one saw it. Jordan smirked slightly. To him, her silence confirmed it all. He mistook stillness for surrender, discipline for defeat. He pushed further. "Let's be honest," he said. "We're not here to hand out microphones to whoever yells the loudest on cable news or who turns a courtroom into a soapbox. We're here to make decisions, to protect this chamber from chaos." He cut his words just enough to let them imply what he wouldn't say outright. "America doesn't need more dramatics," he added. "It needs adults in the room." More than one person flinched at that line, not because it was unexpected, but because it was precise in its cruelty. Delivered calmly, like a man reading off a resume that wasn't hers. And yet Jasmine remained quiet, not still like a statue, but still like a coiled spring. There was no fury, no fluster, only motion, the silent, deliberate kind. Her pen struck a final word, standards, then drew a line beneath it as if crossing out a lie she'd heard too many times before. Jordan mistook it all. He believed he had cornered her, stripped her of ground to stand on. He believed that his word, unqualified, had done what it was designed to do, reduce her. But that was his greatest error, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't folding. She was waiting. He believed she had nothing left to say, but Jasmine Crockett didn't need paper to carry her truth. She was the evidence, and now it was time to present it. She stood slowly with a stillness that wasn't passive, but deliberate, the kind that carries the weight of knowing too much and being underestimated for too long. Her chair gave a soft creak behind her as she pushed it back, one small sound in a chamber otherwise choked in silence. No aide handed her a folder. No script rested in her hand. She took nothing with her but presence. Her walk toward the microphone wasn't rushed, and it wasn't hesitant, it was precise. Every step said, I know where I am. I know who you think I am. And I know exactly why I'm standing now. As she reached the podium, the eyes of the room shifted. Not everyone stood with her, but no one could look away. She didn't look for approval. She didn't glance to her left or right. She didn't clear her throat or shuffle notes or perform humility. She simply stood, both hands resting lightly on the podium, and raised her eyes, not to Jordan, but to the room. Not to a party, but to history. Unqualified, she said, her voice even and low, but resonating with the kind of power that doesn't beg to be heard. It commands it. That's what you said? There was no need to point, no need to say his name. Everyone knew exactly whom she was speaking to, and exactly why. Good, she continued, allowing the word to settle, to challenge, to dare. Then let's define it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense. The kind that comes not before conflict, but just before revelation. A few staffers looked up from their phones. A Republican in the third row leaned back slightly, trying to read her expression, as if that might somehow prepare him for what was coming. It wouldn't. The power of what Jasmine was doing wasn't in volume. It was in clarity. She wasn't just responding to Jordan. She was indicting an entire system that had long used words like qualified to exclude, to gatekeep, to protect power behind a veil of standards that shifted depending on the skin tone or background of the speaker. She had asked to define the word. Now she was about to bury it. Jasmine's hands never moved from the podium. She didn't adjust the mic. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't perform power. She embodied it. Her breath was steady, her gaze fixed, and her voice came not from her lungs, but from years of watching men like Jim Jordan rewrite the rules to protect themselves, then call it integrity. The silence in the chamber wasn't simply the absence of sound. It was the presence of anticipation. Even those on the other side of the aisle who had laughed politely at Jordan's earlier jabs were now still. Something had shifted. Jasmine Crockett wasn't answering back. She was beginning. Let's talk about qualifications, she said, her tone level, not cold but crisp, every word trimmed of fat. Representative Jordan would like you to believe he's the standard, that he's what qualified leadership looks like. So let's examine that, together. There was no grandstanding, no pacing, just her voice. And yet it filled the chamber more fully than any of Jordan's jabs had. She wasn't appealing to a side. She wasn't working for a clip. She was speaking directly to the soul of the room, the truth everyone sensed but few dared to say. She lifted her hand slowly and raised one finger. Number one, he objected to the certification of the 2020 election, even after over 60 court cases, many of them heard by judges appointed by his own party, found no evidence of fraud. She paused just enough, not to be dramatic, but to allow the words to register, to strip away the insulation of partisanship that so often buffered Jordan from accountability. That wasn't patriotism, she said. That was a direct attempt to undermine the Constitution he swore to protect. No yelling, no accusations, just facts, delivered like a legal brief with the blade turned outward. The Constitution, swore to protect, the oath that so many in that chamber wore like a lapel pin, but violated the moment it became politically inconvenient, and she wasn't finished. Her hand lifted again, 2 fingers. Number 2, when subpoenaed by the January 6th committee, he refused to comply. There was movement now, tiny, a flicker of discomfort in one corner of the room, a side glance among colleagues, people shifting in their chairs as if their bodies were reacting to truths their minds had long tried to dodge. He defied lawful oversight, Jasmine said. That's not courage. That's contempt for the rule of law. There it was, the second fracture. Not just a criticism of Jordan's politics, but of the precedent he stood for. The kind of man who preached law and order, but considered himself exempt when the subpoena landed at his door. The kind of lawmaker who weaponized accountability against others but refused to answer to it himself. And still, she was not done. Her voice softened for just a moment, not in tone, but in pace. Slower, heavier, like what she was about to say required care to carry. And number 3, she said, raising her final finger, her hands steady as granite. He was named in multiple testimonies as a man who knew about sexual abuse committed against students at Ohio State University. She let the word knew sit in the air like a confession no one wanted to say aloud. Knew and said nothing. Not once. Not ever. This time the silence was absolute. No coughs, no chair creaks. Even the scribbling of pens stopped. It wasn't just the weight of the accusation. It was the truth behind it. The lingering stain of one of the most chilling scandals in college athletics, and the man now asking for the highest gavel in the house had been named by survivors. Not as the abuser, but as the one who looked away. Jasmine didn't dramatize it. She didn't have to. She wasn't leaning on emotion. She was leaning on the public record, on sworn testimony, on the devastating consistency of the facts. While young men were being violated, she continued, and now her voice bore the hint of something deeper. Not anger, not pain, but moral clarity. While they were begging someone to listen, he chose comfort over courage, silence over service. Every word hit with the weight of lived experience. Not because she had been through that exact horror, but because she had lived inside a system where that silence was standard, where those in power were told they could choose their comfort over someone else's trauma and still call themselves qualified. And now he wants to define me as unqualified? She didn't spit the question. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't turn it into a slogan. She just asked it. And in that single quiet question, everything Jordan had said before, about standards, about leadership, about who belonged, collapsed under its own weight. Then she moved. Barely. A half step closer to the mic. A shift so slight it was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to tighten the air in the room again, enough to signal that what came next wasn't just a response, it was her verdict. If that is what it means to be qualified in this chamber, she said, her tone clear, full, unmistakably steady, then I will proudly accept being called unqualified. No one clapped. No one dared. Because in that moment, the chamber wasn't an arena. It was a courtroom, and Jasmine Crockett had just delivered a closing argument so precise, so undeniable, that even her opposition was forced into stillness. She didn't need applause. She didn't want it. She wasn't looking to win the moment. She was here to mark it. She had marked the moment. But some men cannot let silence stand when it threatens the illusion of control. As Jasmine Crockett's final words echoed across the chamber, the stillness she left behind wasn't just powerful, it was dangerous. Not because it stirred chaos, but because it brought order. It redrew the balance of power without raising her voice. And that was precisely what Jim Jordan could not abide. He rose suddenly, not with dignity, but with heat. His chair scraped back hard against the floor, the sharp screech slicing through the quiet like a blade. It was not the movement of a leader, but the instinct of a man who had just been wounded. In public, by truth. His jaw tightened as he pressed the button on his desk mic. His request was immediate, impatient. "Mr. Speaker, point of order," he barked, but the speaker didn't need clarification. Jordan was already storming toward the center aisle. Cameras pivoted. The chamber held its breath. There was no attempt at restraint. The rhythm of his voice betrayed urgency. Not the urgency of principle, but of pride. He didn't pace like a statesman. He lunged like a man clawing back what he believed was owed to him. And when he reached the microphone, he didn't appeal to the room. He went straight for her. "I don't need to be lectured on integrity," he said, his voice hard, clipped. The chamber tensed, especially by someone who hasn't been here long enough to understand how this place works. It wasn't just rebuttal, it was dismissal, a public belittling, a challenge not to her argument, but to her right to make it. In that single sentence, he reached not for truth, but for hierarchy. He wielded seniority like a cudgel, as if time served absolved accountability, as if presence alone made a man immune to criticism. And then he went further. "I don't need a sermon from someone who's still learning the rules of the game." The word game landed with a jolt. Some in the chamber instinctively looked toward the speaker's chair, wondering if anyone would step in. But the room stayed still, paralyzed not by confusion, but by recognition. Everyone understood what had just happened. The mask had dropped. This wasn't about protocol. This was about territory. About reminding a black woman that in his view, power was still a game, and she was still too new, too bold, too other to be considered a real player. For a second, the silence felt different. Not frozen, but volatile. Jasmine didn't blink. She stood where she was, spine straight, lips steady, not just unfazed, but composed. She waited until Jordan fully stepped back from the mic, giving him all the time he needed to hang himself with his own words. Then, without a glance to the speaker, without shuffling a note, she stepped forward again. The weight of the room shifted as she approached. No need for fire, no need for fury. The burn was already there, etched into every breath of air that hung above the chamber floor. When she reached the microphone, she didn't pause for effect. She didn't lean into the theatrics. She simply spoke. "I didn't come here to play," she said. The words were clean, final, sharp as glass, and twice as clear. "I came here to remind you, this is not an arena. This is a chamber of governance." The effect was instant. Jordan had tried to reframe her strength as insolence, her logic as inexperience, her challenge as a tantrum, and she had dismantled every frame with one sentence. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the floor. Across the benches, heads turned, some in disbelief, some in awe. Even a few on Jordan's side, still half frozen in their seats, could feel it. The line had not only been crossed, it had been redefined. And then, so quietly it almost didn't register, came the first sound of recognition, a single hand clap, somewhere from the row of independents, then another. Slow, uncoordinated, honest. This was not thunderous applause. It was not a performance ovation. It was the beginning of something earned. A few members nodded, not just in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what had just been said, of who had just said it, and of the weight it now carried because it had been delivered not as a rebuke, but as a reminder. The room didn't roar. It settled. It listened. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just responded to a personal attack. She had realigned the conversation, not toward her, but toward truth. She had reclaimed the floor. But in truth, Jasmine Crockett had done something far rarer. She had reclaimed the narrative. Inside the chamber, silence lingered, not empty, but vibrating. Outside, the storm had already begun. The clip of her final sentence, spoken with razor-edge control, "If that is what it means to be qualified in this chamber, then I will proudly accept being called unqualified," was already circulating across X, formerly Twitter. At first, it was just a ripple. A few journalists posted the moment with words like devastating, measured burn, precision strike. Then came the hashtag, first used by a junior staffer at a media firm in DC, who typed it without thinking it would matter. Number who is unqualified. It caught like dry leaves in wind. Within 9 minutes, the hashtag had gone from an insider murmur to a national flashpoint. Phone screens lit up in every corner of the Capitol. Reporters in the press gallery sat up straighter, their laptops glowing brighter. One AP correspondent turned to a colleague and whispered, "It's happening." Another from NBC had already sent the clip to 3 producers. Moments later, CNN's Kyron broke into live coverage. Crockett clip goes viral, House reaction growing. Inside the chamber, the walls hadn't shifted, but the atmosphere had. Staffers on both sides began checking their devices. Some leaned down to show their members the trending feed. One tweet, just a screen grab of Jasmine staring straight ahead, the caption reading, "She didn't blink." He did, was nearing 30,000 retweets in under an hour. Another, from a well-known constitutional law professor, read, "What Crockett just did wasn't political, it was civic. That's the difference." And then came the headlines. Politico, one word, two meanings, one political counterstrike. The Hill, Crockett versus Jordan, when silence became power. Rolling Stone, mic drop. Jasmine Crockett turns GOP's word against them. New York Times, unqualified, a reversal heard around the chamber. None of these headlines had existed 15 minutes earlier. Now they defined the day. In the far row of the chamber, one Republican congressman, Michael Strauss, a centrist from Pennsylvania, sat with his fingers pressed together beneath his nose. He wasn't one for drama, didn't care much for speeches, but what he did care about was credibility. And in less than 5 minutes, he'd seen one of the loudest voices in his caucus get reduced. Not by volume, but by clarity. Slowly, carefully, he leaned toward his chief of staff and whispered, "Get me the whip." Quietly. A few rows up, Congresswoman Jeanette Morales, a moderate Republican from Florida, crossed her legs, picked up her pen, and drew a thick line through her notes where it said, "Jordan, lean yes." She didn't make a show of it. She didn't even change her expression. But the line was clean, bold, unmistakable. She looked up at the speaker's dais and mouthed a single word to her assistant, "Flip." Across the aisle, Crockett sat back in her chair. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't basking in anything. Her hands were still folded, her notes closed. She had said what she came to say, and now she waited. Not for applause, but for accountability. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, the political ground was shifting fast. The hashtag had now passed 1 million interactions. On TikTok, teens were remixing her quote into spoken word tracks. On Reddit, lawyers debated the technical implications of her 3 counts framing: a constitutional breach, a legal defiance, and a moral silence, and someone wrote, adding, "She just delivered a prosecutorial argument on the House floor." The White House press office, caught off guard by the firestorm, released a one-line statement an hour later. "We believe every member of Congress must uphold the values of integrity, accountability, and truth." It didn't name Jordan, but it didn't need to. Jordan himself, back at his desk, had gone quiet. His mouth still clenched, his hands no longer in motion. His team had gone from smug to concern. One aide texted another, "We're losing the middle." Another replied, "He should have never used that word." And in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't about Jasmine anymore. It was about the word, unqualified. It had gone from insult to indictment, from weapon to mirror. And the more people replayed the clip, the more they saw not just her defiance, but his miscalculation. It was no longer about experience. It was about what kind of man used a public forum to diminish a woman's voice, only to be undone by his own arrogance. Inside the chamber, the drift became visible. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic. It was quieter than that, and therefore more dangerous. Votes that had once seemed locked were now uncertain. Aide after aide made discreet trips to the side doors, whispered updates to their members. One whip assistant for the GOP walked the outer edge with a clipboard and eyes that were no longer confident. When approached by a reporter in the hall, he only said, "We're evaluating in real time." The speaker himself knew what that meant. They were bleeding votes. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't just deliver a line. She had shattered the illusion that Jordan's grip was unshakable. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't begged. She hadn't pointed fingers. She had simply told the truth, with evidence, with poise, and with history behind her. And now the chamber, slowly, reluctantly, was beginning to answer her without saying a word. One fold of a note, one text to the whip, one crossed-out line on a ballot sheet. That was how you lost a chamber. Not in thunder, but in increments. And Jasmine? She hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Because the word that was supposed to break her was now busy undoing the man who used it. The final count wasn't a surprise, it was a reckoning. Cold, precise, and irreversibly public. As the clerk's voice carried across the House chamber, reading the numbers without expression, the air thinned, not because the words were unexpected, but because they hit harder than anyone anticipated. 211 votes cast in favor of Representative Jim Jordan, she announced. A pause followed, small, barely a breath. Needed to secure the position, 217. A single number, just 6 votes, and yet it landed like a stone dropped into a glass floor. The result was final. Jim Jordan had lost, not by dozens, not by 1, by 6. A margin too small to write off, too large to argue with, a number so specific it felt like fate, measured, deliberate, and unshakable. The kind of number that didn't suggest political disagreement, but something far more personal. Rejection. There was no cheering, no explosion of drama. The chamber didn't erupt. It recoiled, quietly, fully aware that something irreversible had just occurred. From his seat in the front row, Jim Jordan didn't move. He stared straight ahead, lips pressed into a tight line, jaw set so hard it looked like it might crack. The color in his face, once burning with self-assurance, had drained beneath the surface. His shoulders, always pulled back in confident posture, now seemed heavier, like the weight of that missing 6 had settled directly onto his spine. This was a man who had walked into the chamber already crowned in his own mind, and now stripped of the speakership, not by scandal, but by a small, deadly shift in loyalty. He had nowhere to look but down. He didn't demand a recount. He didn't challenge the clerk. He didn't turn to his allies with the fury of betrayal. Instead, he sat frozen, a man who had not prepared for this outcome, a man who thought inevitability would carry him across the finish line and now had to reckon with a truth much harder than defeat. You were close, but not enough. And somewhere in that distance between 211 and 217 lived everything he had refused to see. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett sat still. Her fingers rested atop the same closed folder she had carried in earlier. Her shoulders square, her breathing even. She hadn't moved since the count was read. Not out of shock, but out of choice, because this moment wasn't about her celebration. It was about what had just shifted in the chamber, in the country, in the story Jordan had tried to write about who belongs in power and who doesn't. She didn't look over at him. She didn't make eye contact. That would have been too easy, too human, too small. Instead, she bowed her head, softly, quietly, a gesture not of gloating, but of gravity. She understood what had just happened. She understood it in the bones of every woman who's ever been called unqualified for speaking too directly, in the skin of every Black professional who's been told they're too loud, too bold, too visible. She understood it in the silence that came after the insult and before the shift. This wasn't about beating him. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. And that understanding surfaced, not in a speech or a headline, but in the faintest expression on her face, a smile barely there, not of joy, not of triumph, but of knowing. Knowing that truth had held its ground, that dignity had remained intact, that the chamber, for all its resistance, still had enough conscience left in it to say, not this time. Her smile wasn't wide. It wasn't broadcast. It was the kind of smile a person wears when something has been set right. Not perfectly, not completely, but unmistakably. In the background, the cameras were still rolling. The press gallery already knew what their stories would say. But Jasmine didn't move for them. She didn't feed them a moment, because she didn't need a headline. She had something more lasting, a number, 6. And for once, that number didn't stand for exclusion. It stood for accountability. That day, Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't wave her arms. She didn't claim a throne. She just stood her ground. And justice, real justice, answered her with silence, numbers, and balance. Justice had answered in numbers, but history, it seemed, was just beginning to speak. As the chamber quietly dispersed, with aides gathering belongings and members drifting toward the exits in tight huddles, the outside world was doing the opposite, converging, zeroing in, lighting up in real time. Jasmine Crockett hadn't walked out the door yet, but her name was already moving like voltage across newsrooms, classrooms, and courtroom group chats. Editors leaned over desks, waving printed transcripts of her remarks. Studio producers barked into earpieces, rearranging live panels to slot in emergency reaction segments. Anchor desks cleared the night's scheduled commentary with surgical precision. There was no time for the usual cycle of political spin. Something rare had happened on that House floor, and the world outside wasn't just watching, it was processing. The moment, the vote, the final line, it all had the quality of a rupture, and in media circles it had a name, a collapse. By the next news cycle, journalists weren't just reporting that Jim Jordan had failed to secure the gavel, they were contextualizing it, framing it, elevating Jasmine Crockett's remarks as the detonator behind a spectacular political unraveling. The comparisons came fast and without mercy. This ranks among the most abrupt implosions of modern congressional ambition, wrote Politico, comparable only to Eric Cantor's primary loss in 2014, or the day John Boehner stepped down amid rebellion, echoed the New Republic. But the tone was different, sharper, more aware of what had just unfolded. Because this wasn't merely a power struggle gone wrong. This was a man, once untouchable, once feared, once presumed inevitable, brought down not by scandal, but by precision, by facts, by presence, by a woman who never raised her voice and yet shook the walls. New York Magazine ran with the headline, "The One-Sentence Verdict, Crockett's Line That Ended Jordan's Momentum." Vanity Fair took it further. Unqualified was just a word until she made it a weapon. Even traditionally cautious outlets like the Wall Street Journal carried the moment above the fold, describing Jasmine's performance as the rhetorical equivalent of a clean legal execution. And then it began to move sideways, into places far from the floor of Congress, but no less consequential. Law schools across the country began circulating the clip before the next day's lectures. At New York University, a constitutional law professor opened class with it. "Before we review Marbury v. Madison," he told his students, "you need to see what real-time constitutional framing looks like, and what happens when someone refuses to let false authority define the terms." At Howard, students cheered as Jasmine's closing line played on a lecture hall projector. At Stanford, a visiting judge paused mid-lecture, turned toward the screen, and muttered under her breath, "God, that was surgical." It wasn't just the political class watching anymore. It was the legal class. Professors, clerks, practicing attorneys, retired federal judges, and most of all, students. Students who saw themselves in her fire, in her restraint, in her refusal to yield to arrogance cloaked in seniority. Some began transcribing the speech by hand. Others annotated it like case law, breaking down the structure of the argument, the three-count framing, the invocation of precedent, the moral clarity of the final pivot. One Yale law student posted a thread that night. "We're not just watching a speech, we're watching a courtroom-style disassembly of a political figure in a public setting. No ad hominem, no fluff, just pure evidentiary takedown. It's what we train for. It's what we rarely see." The American Bar Association's official account even retweeted a segment of the speech with the caption, "Argument, logic, decency. This is why words still matter." But perhaps the most powerful responses didn't come from media figures or legal experts. They came from those who knew silence intimately, from Black women in academia, in nonprofit leadership, in union halls, in courtrooms across America, who had heard the word unqualified in every dialect it came in. Too emotional, too loud, too confident, too aggressive, too green, too ambitious, and now they had a mirror and a moment. A high school civics teacher in Detroit rewrote her Friday lesson plan overnight. "My students are going to memorize this," she said, pointing to Jasmine's closing line. "Not because it's political, because it's true." A civil rights lawyer in Georgia sent the clip to her daughter with just one message. "This is what quiet power looks like." And inside law firms where countless young attorneys had been told to sit back and wait their turn, a new term emerged in private Slack channels and backroom chats. Crockett Clause, defined loosely as the moment someone turns condescension into consequence. Live. Back in D.C., the ripple continued, not as chaos, but as a shift. Jasmine Crockett hadn't set out to make history. She'd simply refused to let someone rewrite it in real time. But now the history books were flipping open, and her name wasn't in the footnotes. It was in the headline. The history books had taken note. But inside the war rooms of Washington, damage control had begun. Even as pundits debated whether Jasmine Crockett's closing line would be studied for decades or merely defined a news cycle, another kind of conversation was erupting behind closed doors. In conference rooms on encrypted apps, in hastily scheduled meetings that avoided official logs, Republicans who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Jim Jordan were doing the thing political survivors do best. They started to whisper. Some whispered about miscalculations, others about optics, a few about discipline lost. But then came the leak, the sentence that shattered what little grip Jordan still had on the narrative. It was a single line in a bluntly worded internal email, accidentally forwarded to a journalist at the Dispatch, time-stamped just 4 hours after the failed vote. It had come from a senior GOP strategist assigned to midterm planning. The subject line read, "Post-floor assessment urgent." Buried between analysis of polling slippage and voter reaction to the Crockett clip was the line no party leader ever wants to see in print. Jordan is no longer an asset, he's a strategic liability. 3-word, strategic, liability, confirmed. And suddenly it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett and 6 flipped votes standing between Jim Jordan and the speakership. It was his own party, his own people. The machine that had once protected him was now diagnosing him like a tumor, naming him, isolating him, preparing to cut him loose. And across the city, those 3 words began to travel faster than any press release. In the West Wing, a senior communications advisor reportedly read the line aloud and said, "That's it. They're moving." At a dinner of conservative donors in Alexandria, the email was screenshotted and passed from phone to phone under white tablecloths, accompanied by stiff nods and silence. No one defended Jordan. No one had to. The language spoke for itself. Inside Fox's primetime control room, a producer looked up from her phone and muttered, "We're going to need a new lead segment." But perhaps the most telling shift came not from media, not from donors, but from within the GOP's own internal data team. Within 24 hours, an internal report was compiled showing plummeting confidence in Jordan among suburban independents and moderate Republican women, a group they could not afford to lose again. In bold red font at the top of the slide deck read the phrase, "Impact contained, but reputationally dangerous." Translation: he had not yet sunk them, but if they didn't act quickly, he would. And just beneath that, Representative Crockett's speech rated as most emotionally resonant Democratic floor moment in 6 years. That wasn't opinion. That was data, emotion, resonance, measured in real-time reaction. Jasmine hadn't just shifted votes. She had shattered assumptions about who holds the mic, who frames the moment, and who gets to define qualified. Yet through it all, she said nothing. As others scrambled, defending, distancing, spinning, Jasmine Crockett stayed silent. Not because she had nothing more to say, but because she didn't need to. She had stood up when it mattered. She had endured the insult. She had absorbed the heat. And now she watched the ripple effects unfold in places where she was never meant to have reach. Behind her, the machine was still trying to run, but its gears were grinding. And Jim Jordan, he wasn't just losing votes. He was becoming a cautionary tale. The chamber had gone quiet. The vote was over. The press cycle was still spinning. But Jasmine Crockett had not said a word. She had walked off the House floor the same way she had entered it, measured, unbothered, and entirely in control of her silence. In the 3 days that followed, she declined every major outlet. CNN, MSNBC, they all reached out. So did half a dozen Sunday shows, and more than a few high-profile influencers. Everyone wanted a soundbite. Everyone wanted a headline. But Jasmine Crockett didn't speak for headlines. She waited. She watched the country speak instead, watched a single moment ignite a storm, watched her words crawl into the marrow of a nation, still trying to decide if justice was supposed to be comfortable or true. She saw the think pieces. She saw the TikToks. She saw the Black law students writing thank you in the margins of their class notes. She saw the right-wing talking heads backpedaling their talking points in real time as the narrative shifted under their feet. And then, when the time was right, she spoke. Not on a flashy morning show. Not in front of a cheering audience. Just a chair, a camera, and a question that had been simmering since the moment Jim Jordan turned to her on the house floor and tried to reduce her entire presence to a single word. Unqualified. The network was local, not national. The format, simple, no political banners, no curated panel. Just her and seasoned journalist David Marin, a man known for asking straight questions and letting silence do the rest. The setting was neutral, a small studio space in D.C. Dark wood, one overhead light, two microphones, no cutaways. The interview began without fanfare. No reel, no recap, no intro monologue. Congresswoman Crockett, Marin said calmly, you've been described in the last 72 hours as poised, prepared, powerful. Some say your words changed the direction of the House, but before all that, you were called one thing. On record, on the floor, in front of the nation. You were called unqualified. He let the sentence hang for a beat. Tell me, how did that land? The room didn't move. The crew didn't breathe. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't look away. And she didn't hesitate. Her voice came quiet at first, but firm, like iron beneath silk. I'd rather be called unqualified by a man who doesn't understand justice, she said, than be called qualified by someone willing to abandon the truth just to keep his seat. There was no drama in her tone, just precision, each word carved clearly, with no need to raise her voice or lean into anger. It wasn't a comeback. It wasn't revenge. It was something rarer, a statement of record. Marin blinked once, then nodded, not as a journalist chasing follow-up, but as a man who understood what truth felt like when it didn't ask to be acknowledged. Jasmine continued, that word, unqualified, was never about my resume. It wasn't about my degree. It wasn't even about my time in office, she said, her voice rising slightly, not in volume, but in weight. It was about who's allowed to speak, about who gets to challenge power, about who gets to walk into that chamber and not apologize for standing their ground. Her eyes didn't shift. Her hands stayed folded. People like Jim Jordan use words like unqualified, not because they believe them, but because they're afraid of what happens when that word loses its power, when it no longer stops you, when you answer it with facts and don't flinch. The clip would later be shared across every major outlet, but at that moment, inside that quiet studio, it wasn't being said for cameras. It was being said for record, for the millions who had heard that word, unqualified, in job interviews, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and in the way people are told to wait their turn even after they've earned it 10 times over. Marin leaned forward slightly. But Congresswoman, he said gently, you didn't just answer it. You reversed it. You turned it into something else. What made you stay so calm in that moment? Jasmine exhaled, not out of exhaustion, but out of memory. Because I've been hearing it my whole life, she said. Not always that word. Sometimes it's too bold. Sometimes it's too passionate. Sometimes it's not the right tone, or wait your turn, or this isn't your fight. But it all means the same thing. You're not supposed to be here. She let the pause carry her forward. So when he said it, when he looked at me and used that word like it was final, what I heard was an insult. I heard fear. I heard him clinging to a structure that's always made room for him and always tried to push people like me out. Her next words came quieter. I wasn't angry. I was ready. And that readiness, that bone-deep, quiet certainty was what turned the tide. Because in a room full of noise, Jasmine Crockett hadn't needed to yell to be heard. She hadn't needed permission to speak. She had waited. She had listened. And when the moment came, she told the truth so clearly it shattered the floor beneath those who had taken its stability for granted. Marin sat back, visibly moved. Congresswoman, he said, this is going to follow you. I know, she replied. Does that worry you? She smiled, not big, not triumphant, just true. No, she said, because I didn't come to make noise. I came to tell the truth, and if that costs me favor, if that earns me backlash, if that makes people in power uncomfortable, good. Then once more her voice found its center. Because comfort never changed anything. The segment would air that evening. By midnight, her quote had overtaken every political headline in America. But for Jasmine Crockett, the moment had already passed. Because the truth didn't need to go viral to matter. It just needed to be said, once clearly, without apology. And that, she had done. And yet, even after the vote was counted, the chamber cleared, and the headlines scorched their way through a stunned political class. Something still lingered. Not in the news cycle, not in the social media firestorm, but in the silence that returned when the cameras were turned off, and the echo of Jasmine's voice gave way to something deeper. Reflection. Because underneath the procedural drama, beneath the political fallout and the stunning reversal of power, there was something more enduring left in the air. Something that couldn't be tallied in votes or quoted in headlines. Something not measured in trending hashtags, but in human memory. It was the question that the entire confrontation had unearthed, word by devastating word. What makes someone worthy? That question had stalked Jasmine Crockett from the moment she entered Congress. It wasn't asked out loud. It was coded. It was systemic. It showed up in glances and skepticism, in patronizing smiles and sharpened silences. And it crystallized, fully, unflinchingly, when a man who had failed upward his entire life dared to look her in the eye and reduce her to a single word, unqualified. But what Jim Jordan didn't understand, and what too many still don't, is that injustice doesn't always wear a hood or hold a weapon. Sometimes it comes dressed in a suit and tie. Sometimes it has a microphone. Sometimes it has seniority. And sometimes it hides in the polite, practiced tone of men who expect not to be questioned, only obeyed. Jasmine Crockett questioned him, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with facts, with composure, with the kind of unshakable truth that only someone forged in silence can carry. And in doing so, she did more than defend herself. She held up a mirror to power, to politics, to America. And that mirror didn't just reflect one man's arrogance. It revealed a system built on deciding who gets to belong and who must keep proving it. So what is the human lesson buried in all this? It is this, that dignity is not something granted. It is something claimed. It's what Jasmine did the moment she stood without notes, without apology, and answered a centuries-old insult with unflinching clarity. It's what every person does when they walk into a room that was never built for them and refuse to shrink. It's what happens when a single voice, steady, prepared, undeterred, breaks through the roar of inherited power and says, "You don't get to define me, not anymore." The lesson is not that she won. The lesson is how she fought, not with fists, not with fury, but with the most dangerous thing you can carry into a space of manufactured authority, truth delivered calmly, in a world that too often mistakes silence for submission and rage for strength. Jasmine proved there's a third path, one forged in restraint, forged in pain, and sharpened by every room she's ever walked into where her very presence was a threat. And the lesson for those who watched, who sat frozen as the word unqualified was thrown like a dart and caught in midair by someone who'd heard it before, is that words can wound, but they can also return fire. Not by mirroring the hate, but by reshaping it. Jasmine's story isn't just about defeating a rival. It's about dismantling a framework, one built on expectation, on gatekeeping, on the myth that decorum matters more than justice, that tenure matters more than truth. She answered that myth with a sentence, and in that sentence lived a deeper promise, that the future does not belong to the loudest man in the room, but to the one who stands her ground, armed with history and refuses to be erased. That's not just a political statement. That's a human one. And it's not over. Because the system she confronted still exists. It still whispers. It still hides behind rules and reputations. But now it does so, knowing that someone like her, someone they called unqualified, can walk into its most sacred chambers and speak so clearly that the entire country has to listen. So what's the real lesson? Power is no longer safe from the truth. Not if that truth shows up, uninvited, unshaken, and unapologetically qualified. But moral clarity means nothing if it stays trapped inside a television screen, if it remains just a quote on a clip, a trending moment, a one-day headline. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand up to be admired. She stood up because it was necessary, because the silence in that chamber was not neutral, it was oppressive. Every second she stayed quiet while that word, unqualified, hung in the air. The system was hoping she'd do what others have done before her. Lower her gaze, let it pass, swallow the insult in the name of civility. But she didn't. She met the moment with facts, with fire, with dignity sharp enough to slice through generations of entitlement. She didn't need to scream to be heard. She didn't need notes to deliver truth. And now, after the vote was counted, the chamber cleared, and the institutions resumed their careful choreography of pretending nothing happened. The only thing left is not her voice, it's yours. Because moments like this don't change history unless people move with them. Jasmine exposed something raw and undeniable. That in the heart of our most sacred halls, power still fears the wrong voice rising, the wrong woman standing, the wrong story being told too clearly. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. It means you're paying attention. Because this story doesn't end with a speech. It doesn't end with 6 votes. It doesn't end with a trending hashtag or a few powerful headlines. This story ends or begins with what comes next. With what we're willing to do now that we've seen what standing up actually looks like. So here's the truth. Power doesn't yield on its own. It doesn't get embarrassed into change. It calcifies. It rebrands. It waits you out. It counts on your fatigue. It depends on you being too busy, too tired, too distracted, too cynical to keep pressing. And so if you saw what Jasmine did and felt a fire, then the question is, will you carry it forward? Will you show up to the town halls no one is live streaming? Will you register 5 more voters than you thought you had time to? Will you speak up at your workplace when someone is silenced in the name of tone? Will you stop laughing politely when someone dismisses a woman's credibility with coded words? Too aggressive? Too ambitious? Not the right fit? Will you remember that in the span of just a few sentences, Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she destabilized a structure built to hold her back? And if she could do that under the lights, in front of the country, with the eyes of every old guard waiting for her to crack, then what's stopping you from standing in your own space and refusing to shrink? You don't need a microphone to name injustice. You don't need elected office to act with courage. You don't need a trending hashtag to be worth listening to. You need only one thing, the will to refuse silence. Because the systems we live under have been telling people for generations to wait their turn, to speak when spoken to earn their place. And what Jasmine did was burn that script on the House floor. She exposed that qualified has never really meant capable. It has meant compliant. It has meant convenient. It has meant you can speak, but only if what you say doesn't make us uncomfortable. And so the call now is not just to clap for her, it is to follow her, to carry that posture of truth into every room that resists it, into classrooms where history is being erased, into school board meetings where facts are being negotiated, into courtrooms where bias wears a robe, into boardrooms where the only voice that matters is the loudest man in the room, into family gatherings where silence is mistaken for peace, into your own doubts, your own fears, your own hesitation, and to meet them with the same steady breath Jasmine met Jim Jordan's insult. Because injustice survives not because people agree with it, but because people let it pass. And if you've ever let it pass before, don't look away now. Look closer and ask yourself, what if Jasmine hadn't stood? What if she had taken the insult and said nothing? What if she had sat quietly like the institution was betting she would? What if she had waited for someone else to speak? You know the answer. You've seen it happen before. You've felt it happen before. But this time it was different. This time she stood. She fired back with facts, with memory, with principle, and the truth shook the chamber. So now the question is simple. When will you stand? Not someday, not after the next election, not when it feels safe. Now because somewhere right now, someone is being told they don't belong. Someone is being passed over, talked over, looked over. Someone is sitting in a meeting where the least prepared person is being praised and the most prepared person is being ignored. Somewhere a voice is being silenced because it doesn't fit the mold of what leadership has always looked like. And if you heard Jasmine Crockett and you felt something rise in you, don't wait for permission. Act, speak, challenge, uplift, interrupt the scripts. Be the person who doesn't let that word, unqualified, go unanswered. Be the person who asks better questions, demands better leaders, protects better truths. Be the person who walks into every room and carries Jasmine's lesson on your back like armor. Calm is power, clarity is rebellion, truth is enough. That's your action, that's your inheritance, that's your obligation. Because justice isn't a headline, it's a habit, and democracy doesn't protect itself. It remembers who showed up when it mattered, so count yourself in and get to work. But even as you rise, as you step forward, there's one more truth you need to carry with you. They will try again. Don't mistake this one victory for the end of the war. Systems don't crumble because one person stood. They regroup. They wait. They whisper behind closed doors and rewrite the rules in daylight while pretending to keep them the same. They pass new laws with old motives. They give different names to the same exclusions. And the next time someone like Jasmine speaks, they'll find a new word to cut her down. Too inexperienced, too divisive, too angry, too loud, too radical. You know the script. You've seen it used before, which is why this moment cannot live alone. It must become practice, the habit of challenging what power insists we accept. It must echo in how you vote, how you hire, how you raise your kids, how you talk about women in meetings, how you interpret leadership not just as confidence, but as conscience. Because what Jasmine did wasn't polished rebellion, it was principled resistance. She didn't just speak clearly, she exposed how rare it is to hear truth inside spaces that pride themselves on order more than justice. And now you've heard it. So what will you do with it? Will you stay loud after the noise dies down? Will you name injustice when the stakes are lower, but the silence more dangerous? Will you protect the next Jasmine before she stands alone in front of 1,000 doubting eyes? Will you catch the insult before it lands on her? Will you back her when the cameras aren't rolling? That's the test. Not whether you cheered when the vote was counted, but whether you remember what it cost her to stand before it. Because behind every moment like this, there's a weight the headlines don't capture. The exhaustion of being dismissed, the discipline it takes to stay calm under attack, the silence afterward where everyone tells you how proud they are. But no one stepped forward when you needed them. Jasmine Crockett didn't win because the room supported her. She won because she didn't need their permission to speak. And she shouldn't have had to be that strong, that alone, for truth to register. So build something different. Build coalitions that don't collapse at the first sign of confrontation. Build communities that don't wait for a microphone to listen to Black women. Build movements that remember it's not enough to be inspired. You have to be involved, because the moment has passed, but the fight is still here, and this time, it has your name on it. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.